Like basic fact. In 1954, Australia had 1 million manufacturing workers. We had a population of, I don't know, about 10 million. Today we've got 25 million people, and we've got about around about 500, somewhere between 500 and 600,000 manufacturing workers. So in absolute terms, we've got half the manufacturing workforce that we had in 1954.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Sunday Sessions, brought to you by the Macquarie University Liberal Club. My name's Edwina, and I'm hosting today with Samrat, and we have the most fantastic guest for you to listen to today, and it's Professor Bradley Bowden. He's a professor in employment relations at the Griffith Business University and adjunct fellow of the Institute of Public Affairs. Why this matters is that there's a large job summit this weekend, and we're looking at how to fix the issues the Australian economy is facing. Dr. Bowden has some ideas he'd love to talk to us about first to discuss what makes an economy work well. Dr. Bowden, would you like to jump in?
Yes, I think the bigger issue that the summit was trying to address, and I don't know whether in making this claim it's a plus or a minus, but the current treasurer, Jim Chalmers, was actually in the distant past one of my students. So I don't know whether that's a plus or a minus for him or for me. But the bigger issue that we're facing, and all Western economies are, is that for the last 10 years, 12 years in Australia, we've had falling real wages. And one of the reasons we're falling real wages is because we've had stagnant or falling productivity. And so one of the big issues, Chalmers and in particular, more than Elbow, is trying to address here is that issue of falling productivity and falling wages, because the two go together. And so what productivity is basically is the number of inputs that you have to make something that you sell. So there are two ways of improving productivity. First, you lower the inputs going in to produce the same amount of things, or you produce more with the same amount of inputs. Now, in terms of inputs, essentially we're looking at energy. So there are two types of energy that go into producing milk or coffee or whatever. There's mechanical energy and there's human energy. So one of the real essential problems that all Western economies have got, and nobody wants to talk about this productivity issue, but if you don't talk about this one, everything else is meaningless, is that it's impossible to increase productivity if you're increasing if you're constantly increasing your mechanical costs. So that's electricity, gas, all of those type of things. And then on the human side, I think people confuse two things. One's the difference between satisfaction and motivation. So a lot of our employment relations in the last 20 years has been directed towards employee satisfaction. So that is giving people more and more benefits in terms of free or childcare, more domestic violence leave. All of these things which increase satisfaction. And the idea is that the more satisfied employees are, the more productive they are. Well, it's actually a total myth. What you want with your employees is motivation, not satisfaction. So when I used to run marathons, I would be motivated before the marathon in my training, during the marathon, when I was running and satisfied when I'd achieved something at the end. So motivation is a stress condition. So what are the things that we're only going to get better productivity and there's higher real wages if employees are actually motivated to lower the costs of what they're doing, or to increase the amount of goods and services they're producing within the wage that they have. So there is, I think if you look at the bigger issues, there is nothing in this job summit that is going to lower the mechanical cost of energy, which is half of the productivity story. Well, it's probably 2/3 of the productivity story. And there's nothing that I can see that is going to direct employees towards producing more with less. Now, if we go back to the 1980s, and that's when I first started teaching employee relations, industrial relations at university, I mean, people were employed, productivity bargaining was linked to getting rid of things like restrictions on overtime and penalty rates and things like that. But nobody talks about that. You know, if you want to employ somebody on a Sunday in retail, you're looking at, up to 250% margin. So there are enormous costs on employers that nobody wants to talk about. So, Edwina, if I was employing you on $20 an hour, right? So you're getting $20 an hour gross. That's what you're getting. It's not what I'm paying as an employer. I'm paying the $20. Then I'm paying 9.5% superannuation. Then I'm putting aside 4 weeks for your annual leave. I'm putting aside 1.3 weeks of your pay for long service leave. I'm putting aside 1 week for domestic violent leave. If you're Aboriginal, I'm Indigenous, I'm setting aside 3 days a week, a year for, Indigenous culture time. So if you add it all up, then there's payroll tax, there's workers' compensation. For me to pay you $20, I'm probably going to be looking about, it's costing me $28 to pay you $20. And so that's just ordinary hours. So that is why so many employers out there, particularly in such small business, have to avoid the legal award system, because if they don't, they can't operate. So I think they're the real crisis issues that this summit's not talking about.
So if the summit's not addressing those issues, what do you think it's addressing, and why is the Labor Party holding it now?
I think that I think there's two reasons. One is window dressing, to make it look as though they're treating productivity and real wages seriously. And the other one is, I think that the Labor Party has a serious objective. It's not like the Turnbull and Morrison Liberal governments. They actually do know what they're doing, in terms of at least furthering their own political causes. And so what they are looking to do, I think the primary purpose of this is to set the ground for a change in the Fair Work Act. And the Fair Work Act has a particular problem that has become a real big problem for trade unions and thence the Labor Party. And it's contributed to falling union membership. It's contributed to less enterprise bargaining. Falling union membership means less union dues. Less union dues means less dues going to the Labor Party. It means less money to fund the Labor Party election campaign, so on and so forth. So the particular problem that they have is what's called the Better Off Overall test, which is BOOT, is the common term. Now, the BOOT test was always a bit of a joke, particularly when Labor Party was in power, because essentially, if you take what was the biggest union, I don't know if it is the biggest union at the moment, probably not. It was the Shop and Distributive Trades Association, SDA, which covers shop workers, McDonald's, Woolies, Coles, so on and so forth. So that they face, if you're in retail, they face huge problems in terms of penalty rates and weekend penalties. So the basic deal, if you go to a shopping centre on a Sunday, you'll often find that Coles and Woolworths are open, but not a lot of the other small businesses aren't. So what happened was that Coles and Woolworths, the SDA would trade off penalty rates on Sundays so that, I'll just take the example of McDonald's. Under the SDA agreement with McDonald's, workers got no penalty rates. So they didn't, normally if you work after 6 p.m, you get 25%. If you work on weekends, Saturdays, Sundays, you get more for working on Saturday, and then you get more again if you're working on Sunday, and you get more again if you're working Saturday night. So the agreement with the SDA and Macca's is essentially they got rid of penalty rates. So that made it a lot more profitable for McDonald's franchisees, because most McDonald's businesses are franchisees. It made it a lot more profitable for them. And in return, Macca's agreed to help sign SDA members up. So there was a trade-off of wages and conditions. So the SDA essentially provided the employer with lower wages and conditions in return for them signing members up. Now, the big place where Coles and Woolworths got the SDA got members from this was at Coles and Woolworths. So then at some point there was this far left group, Trotskyist group, called the Retail and Fast Food Workers Union, which weren't a registered union, but they've become more and more active. And it actually challenged the legality of all of these agreements. And after about 4 years, it actually was successful. So there has been a collapse because the wording of the boot as it stands is that every employee must be better off and every prospective employee must be better off. Now, that's an impossible situation for an enterprise agreement. It's if you're trying to negotiate something for, Coles, hundreds, probably 100,000 workers, to do that, and it's at odds with the whole purpose of productivity bargaining, which is supposed to be, you become more productive, that leads to higher wages and so on and so forth. So, so the boot test became a nightmare for Labor. Now, if Morrison had tried to change it, the Labor Party would have gone berserk. So what they're aiming to do, and this is part of their appeal to the BCA and it's part of their appeal to the small business associations, they're going to water down the boot test, and then they're going to, the other change they will do is enter into industry-wide bargaining. So by industry-wide bargaining, that more the unions negotiate with 100 businesses at once, and it will encompass a lot of people. And so what the unions will be after is they will be selling in the short term benefits to business in terms of lower penalty rates, less penalty rates on Saturday night, Sunday night, as it used to be with Maccas, and to get employers to sign into these agreements. Now, once they sign into them, they're hooked, because Burke, the new employment relations minister, says they will no longer allow people to get out of agreements once they're signed. So when business signs an enterprise agreement, it's for 3 years. So you would think that after 3 years, you walk away from it and that's it. You go back to the award. It's not. The enterprise agreement applies until one party has it terminated by the Fair Work Act. So what they will do is that once people are in to an agreement, they will never get out. So the lower boot test is the carrot to get the donkey to come in on board the deal, to eat the carrot, eat a couple of carrots, thinking it's got a win here, and once they're in the system, then they're in a union enterprise, a union agreement, and the unions can then use that to drive up their members, and then it'll drive up all sorts of other benefits. But the primary purpose of it is to drive up their members, because you drive up members, that's more union dues. You get more union dues, you get more dues go to the affiliation to the Labor Party, get more money at election campaigns from donations from the union. So that's my read of what this is really all about.
If I can follow that line of thought, we've got a productivity problem, we have a stagnant wage problem, but we also have really low unemployment rate, and they're touting that one of the biggest problems we're facing is a skills shortage.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at that issue with productivity and competition and basing how you employ people on their personal, level of satisfaction, isn't that going to fundamentally weaken our economy by adding a lot more people to it and creating essentially economy of high competition while trying to have a backbone that seems to it very, very socially geared? What are the weaknesses that you can see with those three things coming together at once?
So you're talking there about the extra 200,000 people we're going to import into the country each year as part of this.
When it comes to skilled jobs, and also that we already have a productivity and stagnancy problem.
Crisis, Look, let's just take the issue of skill shortages. There and low unemployment. It's almost impossible to find the number of people on unemployment benefit. But I've calculated it's about 750,000. So at the same time that we're talking around of that, we've got low unemployment, we've got a labour shortage, we've got 750,000 odd people on unemployment. If you look at the effect of COVID, there are a number of industries that actually employ less people today than what they did pre-COVID, and that's hospitality. So even though you'll find hospitality businesses that saying they're having trouble getting workers, because often they previously relied on international students and German backpackers. There are actually less people employed in hospitality because there's a lot of hospitality businesses have gone to the wall. Retail's about flat, transport's down significantly. Manufacturing's pretty well flat. So if you look at the sort of private sector coming out of COVID, there are a lot of industries. It's not doing really well. And so they've got a bigger problem than just sort of labour shortage. And so where are the jobs? There are three industries that have increased their employment significantly during COVID. One is private sector administration. So that is, essentially bureaucrats, mainly in the finance sector. The finance sector has gone up significantly. So mainly bureaucrats in private sector organisations, the health industry, and number one is the public service. So we've got this split economy where the private sector is really struggling, and yet we've got this ballooning public sector. And the private sector is under all sorts of pressures. Now, in terms of the immediate job crisis, I think that one of the problems, like in hospitality at the moment, is the Labor Party continuing the $750 COVID sickness benefit. So if you're a casual worker in hospitality, you can demonstrate a positive RATS test, then I might only be picking up $250, $300, $400 a week from doing my shifts at the pub or the coffee shop on a Saturday and Sunday nights. But if I get a positive RATS test, I can stay home and I can pick us for $750. So I think that once that COVID supplement payment goes, that will solve some of the job problem. The bigger problem, I think, is we have a mismatch between job shortages on one hand and lack of opportunity on the other hand. And a lot of, as I said, from my calculations, we've got about 750,000 unemployed.
Sorry, just on the point of the pandemic and the pandemic's impact, do you think it's changed the nature of employment in Australia? Like, for instance, the Department of Justice had a lot of people working from home during the pandemic. And then once, late 2021, as the pandemic subsided, they required more and more people to come into the office, like many other businesses. But one of the rules they started was, if you want to come to the office to work, you have to be vaccinated. And all people working from home have to be vaccinated to work in the office. And they lost a big chunk of their employees because obviously, some people don't want to get vaccinated. So do you think that has an impact on how many people are going into the workforce or being excluded from the workforce?
Yeah, look. It certainly did have an impact, and it's significant that I know in teaching that that they I was actually, because I'm an ex-Queenslander, I was following the Queensland situation. At the beginning of the year, the Queensland government, said that essentially you couldn't work unless you're vaccinated as a teacher, and that created big problems with schools trying to find teachers. And then, of course, down the track, as they've actually got rid of those mandates. So I think that has created a problem. That was a problem. I think it was a short-term problem. I think the bigger problem is that employers have, through this working from home, have surrendered, the most basic thing of an employer, which is managerial prerogative. If you go to the United States and Canada and you go to a unionised agreement, the agreement always starts off with two clauses. One is that is to recognise on that the employer recognises the union, and on the other side, the unions recognise managerial prerogative. That is a management's right to essentially run its business as it sees fit to the needs of that business. Now, I think one of the absolute most catastrophic and disastrous things that have come out of COVID has been this, management's essential inability to manage its workforce. Now, I think most of us, you hear the stories of, I'm more productive at home, sitting around in my pajamas, with my cat in my lap, and but I think that's confusing satisfaction with motivation. And the management has clearly lost control of their workforce. And once that control's lost, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for employers to get that control back. And unless management has control and the ability to direct their employees where they want them, when and where they want them, unless they can adequately supervise them, and it's hard enough to supervise. There's a big problem, and it's hard enough to supervise people in the office. I mean, let's face it, a lot of people, most of us, what do we do when we get to the office? Well, we get a cup of tea, get a cup of coffee. We go and, we log into our site. We go and look at the Facebook site, see what our mates have done on Facebook overnight. So we're doing non-business things all the time at work. You blow that into, what's happened. I think it's a disastrous loss of control. And it's not just the specific issue of working from home. It's the general problem of getting employees back into the idea that the boss is the boss. So I think that one consequence of this down the track, if it continues, is that working from home will end up as the working from anywhere. So, Edwina, why would I pay you $50 an hour to sit at home in Sydney with the cat in your lap, in your pajamas, when I can pay someone in the Philippines or India $5 an hour to do it without the cat sitting on their lap and without their pajamas? And so I think that it's short, but it's a problem. But I think it will reinforce a movement, if it continues, of shifting from working from home to working from anywhere.
Do you think regaining that control is one of the desired goals for the unions and the business groups? And what else are they trying to achieve at this summit? What are the things that the unions and business groups are agreeing to in terms of common bargaining that will change some of these problems?
Well, they'll make them worse. I mean, let's basic fact. When unions began enterprise bargaining in the 80s, it was driven by the Manufacturing Workers Union. The Manufacturing Workers Union, also called the Metal Workers Union, was at that time the biggest union in Australia. Today, roughly 2/3 of workers come from three. 2/3 of union members in Australia come from three industries: public service, health, and education. So they are all public sector, taxpayer funded, either directly taxpayer funded or indirectly taxpayer funded industries. They're also, to be honest, heavily feminised. So the issues that when we're talking about union members, I think we've all got a picture of John Setka in our mind, of the old-fashioned standover merchant. And look, and Setka's brutally effective at what he does. But union density in the construction industry is only 14%. The last time I looked, it's probably less now. So the only place that where Setka and the CFMU has any control are the high rise. where they can strangle supplies in and out of job sites. So if we're talking about unions, who are unions today? The great bulk of them are teachers, university academics, public servants, nurses. That's who we're talking about. Now, they're not interested in productivity. They're not interested in producing more with less. And in some ways, it's difficult to do that in those type of service sector industries. Like if you're in intensive care, do you really want one nurse per 5 people, or do you want one nurse per 20 people? Well, if I was in intensive care, and I've been in intensive care, then I would want one per 5, or even one per 2. So it's the union constituency is not interested in productivity, and what they are interested in is cultural issues. And so what you will find as we get into the enterprise agreements, that there will be this trade-off in industries, particularly like small businesses where unions don't have any members, and they're basically trying to hook employers with, offer them a carrot to suck them in. But the whole culture of our union movement is totally and utterly different from what it was in the 80s. These people, the people like the Sally McManuses of the world, who is the head of the ACTU at the moment, these people are not interested in productivity. They're not interested in lowering the cost of energy going into a business. They're interested in cultural issues. So if you look at one of the things that Albo's pushing at the moment is to go to 20 days domestic violence leave per year. So I mean that's an indication, and they'll hold that up as a productivity, but as a productivity, because by having people at work who are who are not subject to can take time off, it can move away from a domestic violence situation, then they're going to be more satisfied, they're going to be more committed. That's how they'll dress it up. So what the unions will be mainly interested in where they get agreements is those type of social and cultural issues. So they'll be looking for, more things for, the two ones they're talking about at the moment are domestic violence leave and extended leave for paternity leave. So I just don't think that unions will be interested in productivity, because it's just the nature of the animal, that they're a different animal from what they were in the 80s. The only thing that's constant, I think, in unions is a fairly, the people have survived in unions is that they tend to know what they're doing. They tend to be cynical. They tend to be ruthless. They know how to sort of get people into an agreement and then screw them over once they're in. I think that and they I've been a union member myself, but I certainly don't think that this job summit will help any of our fundamental economic problems.
I think one of the questions lots of people will be thinking about when it comes to job summit is, even prior to the pandemic, the economy was growing at quite a constant rate of about 3 to 5%, sometimes more than that. With the current inflation rate and apparently low unemployment rate, where's all that growth going? How come wages aren't growing? And what do you think the difference is between genuine wage growth and fake wage growth is?
Well,
Do you think the summit will address that?
well, yeah, look, the Australian economy was growing before, but it was growing very little in per capita terms. So it was the major growth was immigration. So when you have migrants, when you're adding 200,000 migrants a year, then that's a lot of apartments to be built. It's a lot, it means more roads. So there's a direct link there. And I think that was a key driver of it, but there was no productivity growth. And so there was no growth per capita. So I think Australians have been feeling for a long time that they weren't getting any richer, and there's a reason for that. They weren't. And if you look at the immigration, it's essentially a great big Ponzi scheme. So let's just we've got 200,000 migrants plus we had we had about 1 million international students. So that's a lot of people coming in. So that puts up the demand for, in particular, inner city apartments. Inner city apartments go up, then that's a big boom for the property sector. And it's real good news for the CFMEU and a number of the other unions, because they ruthlessly control the inner city property sector. So that directed people in, and that created jobs. It boosted the superannuation funds, because they were all heavily, a lot of them, particularly CBUS, were heavily invested in it. The superannuation funds benefited from the infrastructure bills, the apartment bills. So the super funds were heavily represented at the Job Summit, and the banks weren't. There was actually no representative from the banks other than Anna Bligh, who was the head of the Bankers Association and the former Labor Premier of Queensland. So there was no representatives from the banks, but there were lots of representatives from the super funds. So the super funds are all 50% union controlled. The industry super funds are all 50% union controlled. In effect, they usually control at least some of the other 50% through sympathetic employers. The superannuation funds are one of the major lifelines that keep unions alive today. Through the super funds have donations to unions. It's disguised in a lot of ways. They normally do it by things like paying enormous amounts for ads in union newspapers and union magazines. So it's one of the things that the Job Summit actually talked about, and the Labor's talking about, is that they won't. They're getting rid of a Morrison era legislation that would allow force super funds to report where they're giving their donations. So as unions have shrunk, they've relied more and more on the super funds to keep them alive, and of course some of that super union money then goes to the Labor Party. So I think getting that whole Ponzi scheme again, get going again, it has the benefits of the sort of a corporate constituency that hangs off government intervention and you know that type of activity.
What you're saying is super funds prop up labour unions, and
Yep.
super fund growth kind of makes the economy look good, and the
Yeah.
high rate of immigration kind of grows the GDP, but everyone's slice of the pie stays the same.
That's roughly
So
yeah.
what would you say, like,
and for unions, I mean, yeah, it's like if you stop immigration, then and the economy starts growing again, then obviously it creates a labour shortage. And genuine labour shortages will drive up real wages. Well, have the potential to drive up real wages, but they can drive up real wages by largely simply taking money off the employer in the short term. So if you don't have productivity growth, so the per capita wealth in the nation stays the same, which is the situation we're in, have been for the last 15 years or so. If the productivity growth remains the same, how do you get real wage growth if the per capita economy is not growing? Well, the only way you can get it is to get it off the employer.
You can't really. You're just kicking the can down the road by convincing everyone that they're better off when really they're not. It's saying one thing and then doing something else, in effect, really.
Yeah, and to the extent that you do actually steal it from the employer, then most private sector employers are struggling at the moment, and if the private sector employers' profits go down because they're having to pay more of their, the share going to profits goes down and the share going to wages in the business goes up. I mean, in the short term, that will increase real wages, even though there's no productivity growth. But it won't for very long, because what the employer will do is say, shit, can't afford this, I'm going to have to lay people off. So, or they'll go out of business. So, that's why the productivity is the key for the economy as a whole and for the private sector. But it's not the key for the public sector. What the public sector relies on is tax transfers and government borrowing. So if you're in the public sector, what determines how many jobs you are or how much wages you've got is how much money the government is prepared to spend. And so those in the public sector, it's essentially about a tax transfer from the private sector to the public sector and then borrowing. And so that is certainly what we have seen in Australia over the last 15, 20 years. We've seen a constant rundown of the private sector outside of mining. Like basic fact, in 1954, Australia had 1 million manufacturing workers. We had a population of, about 10 million. Today we've got 25 million people, and we've got about around about 500, somewhere between 500 and 600,000 manufacturing workers. So in absolute terms, we've got half the manufacturing workforce that we had in 1954.
But is that an economic complexity problem, or is that because automation and the things that people want to do for work has changed?
It's a bit of both, but it's more that we have made our manufacturing sector uncompetitive.
Sorry, Sam, I interrupted you.
Yeah,
no. I was just thinking out loud.
Yeah, the number one area, 10 years ago, and that were Australia, the most important area of Australian manufacturing was what is referred to as base metals manufacture. So it's the transformation, making steel and above all making alumina and aluminium. So we had an enormous aluminium and alumina sector, particularly at a place called Gladstone in central Queensland, Portland and Victoria, which is about 40 minutes drive from where I'm sitting now, in Kurri in near Newcastle in Tasmania. Now, that to the extent that sector survived, it's on life support because it's heavily energy reliant. They describe aluminium as as solidified electricity. So, if you look at our manufacturing sector, I mean, we've got fertilizer plants closing. There's an incredible shortage of fertilizer in the world. The number one ingredient for fertilizer is natural gas. So we've got a gas problem, in Australia, even though we're exporting a lot of it, and it's a bit of a complicated story. But we've crucified through various means our private sector, and at the same time we've got this ballooning public sector, and that's a really key Labor union constituency, that ballooning public sector. The problem is that at some point or other, there's going to come a crunch with the government debt, and there'll have to be a rollback of that. But I can't see this government or this Job Summit attacking that problem, because that constituency is their core constituency. The industry that's got more unionists is the public sector, and it's grown at something like 7.5% during COVID per year.
Yeah. So just to cap things off, if we're not being cynical and saying death and tax is the only certain thing in life, what do you think the best case scenario is for the summit? What do you think the best thing is that could come out of it? And then what do you think will actually come out of it?
Best for who?
Best for Australia. What do you think the best thing the summit could do is? And do you think, ideally it could actually do that?
Look, to the extent that I see any good coming out of the summit at all is to the limited extent that it gets people talking about productivity again, which we haven't seriously talked about for a very long time, and we confuse productivity with making employees more satisfied when it's a total different mindset. So to the extent that it has any good, it's talking about productivity and real wages. I think that's probably the only good that I can see coming out of it. I think the rest of it is it's providing a smokescreen and a cover for a strategy that was worked out well before the summit, and it is mainly directed at providing the groundwork for some significant changes in the Fair Work Act. And there are three changes in particular. Change of the Better Off Overall test, which will enable unions to trade off penalty rates and overtime and things. And look, there's a whole problem with penalty rates, but they'll keep the high penalty rates so they can trade them off, rather than saying, so anyway, sticking to the point, they'll change boot so they can trade off penalty rates in things like retail and hospitality to lure people into industry-wide agreements. So that's change number one. Change number two is they'll bring in industry-wide agreements that will enable unions to increase their bargaining a lot more easily over a lot bigger sector of the workforce. And the third thing that they will do is, and they will make it illegal, that they will cancel the clause that enables enterprise agreements to be terminated once they're negotiated.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bowden.
Once you're in it, you're in it for life. You know, a bit like a sort of marriage with no prospect of divorce.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bowden. This has been a fantastic Sunday Sessions. We hope everyone watching enjoyed it and found a little bit of interesting financial information and also a little bit of cynicism. Because I think, Dr. Bowden, what you're telling us is to look over everything with a weather eye. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. We would love to see you next time. Have a wonderful Sunday afternoon.
Thank you.